Well, thank you very much. Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in the ICI meeting and to deliver this presentation. So, first of all, I want to tell you, if you weren't aware, that the heart failure pandemic is already here. The epidemiology of heart failure in the United States is reviewed on this slide. It's similar to other countries around the world. The bottom line is that heart failure represents a major public health problem, resulting in substantial morbidity and mortality for our patients. In the U.S., there are currently about 6.5 million patients with heart failure, and the incidence is now approaching 1 million per year. Mortality is high. There are lots of hospitalizations and lots of outpatient visits, all at a tremendous cost, exceeding $30 billion per year, and that again is in the U.S. alone. Many patients remain highly symptomatic and substantially disabled. At any point in time, about 30% to 40% of our heart failure patients are categorized in New York Heart Association Class 3 or Class 4, meaning that they have a high degree of disability. By 2030, the prevalence will increase to more than 8 million, and the total costs are expected to increase by 127% to more than $70 billion. Heart failure is also a global pandemic affecting at least 26 million people worldwide. Now, what's our goal of heart failure therapy? Well, we want to keep patients well and out of the hospital. And in this regard, I want to emphasize the importance of achieving and maintaining an optimal fluid and pressure status. And that's because we know that when patients are too wet, when they have elevated intracardiac and pulmonary artery pressures, or increases in lung fluid content or total body fluid excess, they have increased symptoms, they're at increased risk of hospitalization, they're at increased risk of arrhythmias, and they have increased risk for mortality. On the other hand, when patients are too dry, they have low blood pressure, they may be dizzy or lightheaded, they're at risk for syncope, and at risk for worsening kidney function. So the goal here is to get it just right. We don't want our patients to be too wet, and we don't want them to be too dry. And when patients are just right, they feel well, and they are at the lowest risk for hospitalization or for death. Now, this discussion is focused on monitoring patients in this pandemic to improve clinical outcomes. So let me now talk a bit about remote monitoring in heart failure. And I'm going to describe to you 5 prerequisites that I believe are necessary for success in remote monitoring and management of heart failure patients. And I've developed these 5 prerequisites over about 25 years of experience with many various monitoring technologies. And for any of the innovators in the crowd who are in this arena, who are developing monitoring technologies, I'll ask you to take these prerequisites to heart. So first, we must have the appropriate signals. We need to measure the right thing. Our sensors must measure the underlying pathophysiology leading to worsening heart failure symptoms and to clinical events. And I would propose that in heart failure, those signals are intracardiac and pulmonary artery pressures and lung fluid content, hemodynamic and clinical congestion, which drives worsening of heart failure symptoms and the need for heart failure hospitalization. These sensors must be accurate, and there's a lot of, I would say, firepower and engineering in this room, and you all know how to design things to a great deal of accuracy. But in addition, I think one of the biggest lessons I've learned over the years is that these sensors must provide absolute values rather than relative ones. For example, it's not sufficient to know when the lung is relatively wet or relatively drier. We really need to know when the lung is normally dry and when wet, quantitatively how wet, in order to enable the fourth prerequisite is that the information must be directly actionable in order to improve, to change clinical outcomes. And then finally, the fifth A here of these prerequisites is that treatment algorithms are necessary to support clinical decision making, because if clinicians don't know what to do with the information, if they don't use the information, they're not going to improve clinical outcomes. So let me take you through a quick journey of the past 20 years and what we've learned about improving outcomes in heart failure patients. And I borrowed a figure here from a good friend, Phil Adamson, who in 2009 published this figure in a paper looking at the road to heart failure hospitalization and the physiological markers of the development of worsening heart failure. And let's start with weight changes and heart failure symptoms. Now, for many years, it seemed logical. It was intuitive to believe that if we targeted our heart failure interventions based on changes in heart failure symptoms and daily weights, we could have a tremendous impact on improving clinical outcomes. Well, it turns out that that's not the case, and I'm going to call this era garbage in, garbage out. This is the computer programmers saying, and talk a little bit about telemedicine focused on heart failure signs, symptoms, and daily weight monitoring. And while this is still in our heart failure guidelines, there is now a tremendous amount of evidence that shows that it just doesn't work. I'm going to show you one example, but there are now dozens of studies, large randomized controlled trials that are similar to this one, the BEAT-HF study, which was led by Greg Fonaro's group at UCLA, included 6 academic medical centers in California, targeted patients with acute decompensated heart failure, applied an intervention that combined health coaching, telephone calls, and telemonitoring with daily electronic collection of blood pressure, heart rate, symptoms, and weight, and then employed centralized nurses to conduct telemonitoring reviews, implement protocolized actions, and make calls to patients for a clinical intervention. And the bottom line is that this approach resulted in no improvement in clinical outcomes. Whether one looks at 30-day or 180-day readmissions or mortality, there is no difference seen here between the telemonitoring managed group and the standard of care group. And these findings have been replicated in many other studies, such as the TELE-HF trial, TENS HMS, the first TIM-HF trial, and others. So why do these trials not work? Well, they work because changes in weight and symptoms and vital signs are very poor surrogates for hemodynamic and clinical congestion, and their sensitivity for predicting a heart failure decompensation event is very low. I'll show you just the example for daily weight monitoring, a class 1 guideline in our heart failure recommendations, but with a sensitivity ranging from only 10 to 20% in the prediction of a heart failure hospitalization. This is just not good enough. It's not good enough to guide heart failure therapy in a way to keep patients well and out of the hospital. Well, what precedes changes in weight and symptoms on the road to heart failure hospitalization? Well, we know that there are changes in transthoracic and intrathoracic impedance, which suggests that lungs might be getting wetter, and there's autonomic adaptation, activation of the sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic withdrawal, detectable changes in heart rate variability that occur as heart failure is worsening. And so for a period of time, about a decade ago, we got very excited about these sorts of measures. But I'll call this era the era of unfulfilled promises, using telemedicine focused on cardiac implantable electronic device-based physiological markers. And we can discern a lot of physiology from these devices. They enable us to measure resting or nighttime heart rate variability, patient activity level, intrathoracic impedance, arrhythmia burden, ventricular rate during atrial fibrillation, the percent of pacing, and the incidence of VT or VF episodes and shocks. And one might think that with all of this information, we've got to be able to figure out a way to make patients better and to keep them out of the hospital. But this approach has failed as well. And the most important example of that is the DOT-HF trial, or Diagnostic Outcome Trial in Heart Failure, which was a prospective randomized controlled intervention trial of intrathoracic impedance monitoring using an implantable cardiac rhythm management device in an attempt to keep patients out of the hospital. You can see the characteristics of patients enrolled in the trial shown on the slide, but let me make a long story short. It was thought that when patients demonstrated a relative change in lung fluid content, that clinicians might see them more frequently in the clinic, but they'd know what to do, and they'd intervene in a way that would keep patients out of the hospital. Well, that hypothesis was only half true. As it turns out, there was a significant increase, about a threefold increase in outpatient clinic visits. But in addition to that, there was a nearly twofold increase, that's increase, not a decrease, in heart failure hospitalizations. And the reason for that is, what do clinicians do when you give them a predictor of risk, when you tell them you should worry about a patient? They worry about the patient, but they don't know what to do. They put them in the hospital. So this wasn't the right approach for keeping heart failure patients out of the hospital. Well, at the very beginning of this road to heart failure hospitalization, we now know what occurs, and that are increases in intracardiac and pulmonary artery pressures, as well as increases in lung fluid content, hemodynamic, and clinical congestion, which really begin this journey to heart failure hospitalization. And so this third phase on our journey, I'll call, we finally got it right. And this is heart failure management focused on intracardiac and pulmonary artery pressures, or absolute measurement of lung fluid content. So there have been tested over the past 2 decades a number of approaches. I'm going to start with the implantable hemodynamic monitors and then briefly mention some of the wearable technologies. But you can see that we've developed and tested over the years RV pressure sensors, PA pressure sensors, and more recently left atrial pressure monitoring systems. And of course, this all started with Medtronic's Chronicle implantable RV hemodynamic monitoring system, which was tested in the Compass HF trial, a trial that produced a negative result because it was small and underpowered. But from it, we learned that there was clearly a relationship between intracardiac or pulmonary artery pressure in this example and clinical outcome. You can see that as patients' pressures rise, there is a steep linear increase in the risk of heart failure hospitalization. And so using the paradigm I showed you earlier, we conclude that these patients are too wet, these patients are too dry, these patients are just about right, and ideally we would like to keep the pulmonary artery diastolic pressure as a surrogate of LAP or the LAP in a range of about 8 to 18 or 8 to 20 millimeters of mercury, where patients are at the lowest risk for a heart failure event. So that hypothesis was confirmed in the CHAMPION trial using the CardioMEMS implantable pulmonary artery pressure sensor. The system is shown on this slide. I'm sure many of you have seen it before. For time's sake, I won't take you through all of the technology, but the system was tested in a randomized controlled pivotal trial for US FDA regulatory approval called the CHAMPION trial. 550 patients randomized to a treatment or control group. Everybody got the sensor. This was a single-blind study. The clinician was allowed to view the sensor data in the treatment arm patients, but not in the control arm patients. There were algorithms based on pressure goals, easy algorithms. If the pressure is elevated, increase the dose of a diuretic. If that doesn't work, add or increase the dose of a vasodilator to bring those pressures down. And what did this result in? It resulted in a significant reduction in heart failure hospitalizations. This is an annualized risk reduction of 33% in heart failure hospitalizations, significant reduction in death or heart failure hospitalizations, and importantly, no downside, no increase in other types of hospitalizations, so that there were significant reductions in both all-cause hospitalization and the combined risk of death or all-cause hospitalization. Now, it's important to note that this works not only in patients with reduced ejection fractions, but also those with preserved ejection fractions. There was no EF requirement for enrollment in the CHAMPION trial, and we demonstrated significant reductions in heart failure hospitalizations regardless of LV ejection fraction. So this, in fact, represents the first approach to improve clinical outcomes in patients with HFpEF or diastolic heart failure. There are new technologies being developed, and I'm happy to say that many of these are being developed here in Israel. I'll show you one example of the VLAP system from Vectorious Medical. This is designed to function from the interatrial septum. It represents the world's first microcomputer implanted within the heart. It's wireless, it's battery-free, it's digital, it's miniature. It's interrogated using this sash-like loop antenna worn around the body. The left atrial pressure data is sent to a data analysis system, and then it enables remote heart failure management using a decision support system based on artificial intelligence. First-in-man studies are now underway, and we hope to be into pivotal trials with this system in about a year or so. This is the first in human clinical study actively enrolling patients in Germany, the UK, Italy, and in Israel. There are now about a dozen patients enrolled in this trial. The aim is to enroll about 30 patients or so, with the first 20 supporting CE marking in the EU. The primary endpoint is safety, usability, and accuracy, but beyond this first 3-month technology evaluation, the clinician can then use the information to manage their patient in a proactive manner, much like we manage patients in the CHAMPION trial or do commercially today with the CardioMEMS implantable hemodynamic monitor. Now, an alternative to an implantable device is a wearable device, and there are an increasing number of approaches for non-invasive assessment of congestion or heart failure clinical status. For time's sake, I can't cover all of them, but they're really exciting developments coming along. I'll show you this one that is also an FDA-approved device and available commercially around the world called the REDS technology. This is a wearable technology, takes a measurement in about 90 seconds and provides a measurement of absolute lung fluid content. Now, how do we use that? We know that the normal lung is comprised of about 20% to 35% fluid content. So if you're above 35%, your lungs are wet. And if you're 45% rather than 40%, your lungs are wetter. So you get a quantitative measurement of lung fluid content. And if you're below 20%, you're too dry. And you can implement an algorithm, much like we implemented in the CardioMEMS study, the CHAMPION study, to use this information to achieve stability, maintain stability, and keep patients well and out of the hospital. And it looks very much like our pulmonary artery pressure tracings, but now it's these lung fluid content values. And you can see in this example, the patient started off at 45%, was diuresed down to about 25 to 30%, and then the goal is to keep them there for long-term stability, well and out of the hospital. And there now is a mountain of data supporting the use of this particular technology. It's been validated by gold standard comparison to computed tomography. There are outcome studies, there are point-of-care studies, there are in-home use case scenario studies. This study was done in Israel, 3 centers. I want to credit Ofer Amir and his colleagues that did the first 50-patient intervention study with a home use case scenario and demonstrated remarkable reductions, 90% reductions in the risk of heart failure rehospitalization with this technology. The SMILE trial, which was just recently presented in September at the Heart Failure Society of America, a larger study designed to confirm this home use case scenario. And in the modified ITT in patients who used the technology as intended, a 58% reduction in recurrent heart failure hospitalization, and a number of point-of-care use case scenarios in the clinic, in the home, in the emergency department that have also demonstrated improved clinical outcomes. And then I'll just leave you with emerging technologies, which includes telemedicine focused on integration of multiple physiological and behavioral inputs along with artificial intelligence. So in summary, weight changes and symptoms are unreliable, late, and only indirect markers of heart failure decompensation. Autonomic adaptation and impedance changes may be used in risk stratification, but are not directly actionable. However, pressure and fluid changes enable proactive and personalized heart failure management and really represent, I believe, the emerging standard of care for remote monitoring and management of heart failure patients in 2019. Thank you for your attention.